What's the first big historical event that you remember as a youth? That kind of, that really stands out in your mind, and where you're just like, oh my gosh, and it was kind of one of those like flagpole moments. We all kind of have that one thing that we remember. What's something to you that stands out that you remember, if it's local or if it's national or global type thing?
I'd say there are two events that stand out in my mind. One of them is very subtle, though, very vague in my mind.
Okay.
When I was very young, my dad coached high school basketball, and I remember January 1991 as the Persian Gulf War was starting. I don't remember anything about the war itself, but I remember that during the national anthem, during the basketball game, that people were crying because a lot of people in the crowd had family members who were being deployed overseas as we speak. And so it was something out of the ordinary that stuck out to me, and therefore I remember, even though I was only about 3.5 years old when that happened. And so, I don't remember watching it on television or anything like that. But I look back and like, oh yeah, that makes sense now. The other one is the Oklahoma City bombing, and I was in about first grade when that occurred. And I think, and as is often the case, history is most pertinent when you have a human connection to it, whether it be in real time or in the classroom. And one of the things that made that event stick out to me was that iconic photo of the firefighter holding and cradling the young baby that had been killed in the daycare. Because that event happened just around the time that my brother turned 1. And when I saw that, I thought of my little brother, and I thought, how horrible, and I perceived it through the lens of a big brother who had a younger sibling who was only a year old. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me in that regard.
Wow, those are two so we haven't had two ones like that. I think maybe one of our first or second podcasts we had some Persian Gulf,
but no one's done it. The Oklahoma City bombing.
But I remember, I'm trying to remember what I remember of the Oklahoma City bombing, and to be honest, what I remember that it happened, but honestly, what kind of really drove home, what sticks in my memory, like when someone says, hey, what do you think of when you think of the Oklahoma City bombing, is honestly many years later when I went back and visited the memorial. So I was driving with my brother from California out to Maryland where I was going to college, and we drove through Oklahoma City. And so we actually made a point to stop, right? This is before like iPhones and all that stuff, right? So this was 2002 timeframe. And so we made a point to stop in Oklahoma City and go see the memorial, and just kind of how powerful that memorial is in Oklahoma City, because they have kind of the one side that shows 1 minute and then the other side that shows basically a minute later, right? And I don't remember what the times are. I think it's like 4 and 2. Those are the minutes that I remember. I don't remember exactly what the time of day was. But to me, that's what stands out, because I think, like you said, when you have that personal connection, and to me, that personalized it, was actually going there and seeing these memorials, I don't know if they were actual grave sites or just markers, for the people that passed there. But that's an interesting one that struck home to you.
And I find that so interesting, Jared, because the image is what resonates with you, and you do real history. You do image you're talking about images on film, and what they, what kind of feelings they give to people. But that image is, when I think of the Oklahoma City bombing, that's the image that comes to mind for me. That famous photograph of the firefighter holding the little girl. It's almost reminiscent of Jessica coming out of the well, right? Because all you see is like an arm, right? And you can tell that the arm is battered.
Yeah.
Right. So it's been abused in some way. So that child has been through trauma.
Yeah.
And it is so. And in both pictures, there is like a person of law enforcement or a firefighter holding the child. So you have this feeling of protection, unable to protect, right?
Yeah.
So it evokes a lot of feeling, right?
So Jared, do you think that the reason, not only for the image, but you mentioned like your brother, I mean, do you think that that was kind of the first time for you that you were kind of, we talked to Jared from the Daily Bell Ringer last week or the week before, and he says, right, kids in their youth tend to be, for lack of a better word, narcissistic, right? It's kind of all about them. They don't, when they're young, and that's just how people grow and mature. Do you think that was kind of a moment where that kind of snapped and you kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm a big brother, I've got a family, and do you think that's what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as you suggested, that big brother perspective, that you have to look out for little ones,
Sure.
if you're the bigger one. It also gave me a sense that there are bad people in the world. And
Yeah.
there's a whole world out there that I don't understand, that I've never been exposed to. And that day was a very eye-opening one, for me as a first grader.
Yeah, and
Wow, you were so young.
And I think to me too, the other points that stand out to me is that's kind of the first time that I remember of like this kind of homegrown, quote unquote, right, kind of terrorist.
Bad
They
guy.
didn't call it that back then, right? They didn't really have
Domestic terrorists, yeah.
They didn't kind
I
of
don't
have
think they called it
domestic.
that either.
They didn't have the kind of the term domestic terrorism or anything like that. But that was kind of the first time I think it was so public. And part of it was the era, right? TV was becoming more and more accessible and cable news and all that stuff. But those are two very interesting ones. I appreciate you sharing those with us. Do your family kind of remember anything about that? Like, did you ever talk to your family about like, hey, I remember when this happened because of,
Not too in depth. I should revisit those and see how my parents perceive them, because
Sure.
my parents were at that basketball game with me, and so they could
Yeah.
probably name some of the people who may have been showing emotion in the moment. So I think those are topics worth revisiting with them.
Yeah, and again, that's interesting that at such a young age you remembered, right? I mean, you said you were what, 3.5, maybe 4. I'll be honest, I don't think I remember anything. From when I
Jared
was
seems
that
like
young.
a smarty.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
a lot. You guys are a lot. I'm the dumb one in this trio right
To
here.
be so self-aware
Yeah.
is that takes a lot of intelligence there.
Well, and we talked to someone else who had a similar, I think it was Chris Witt from the Witt Docs, Chris Witt from the Witt Docs Cemetery Tours YouTube channel. He remembers talking about, I think it was the Gulf War,
Yeah.
but because they kept bringing it up in his church. So, right, he's from Kentucky, right? So, church family and all that stuff. And he just remembers all of a sudden they were talking about this, what was happening with the Gulf War, but they were talking about it in church. And he said there was a couple terms, and I can't remember what they were, but a couple words that kind of really drove home with him. And for him, it was similar to what you said about, maybe not about the Gulf War, but about your brother. But he said it's the first time he felt like, hey, I was in church in this safe space, and all of a sudden there felt like there was this outside threat. There was something outside that kind of pierced through. So that's really interesting. So to move on to our third question, which kind of, this I think is a natural progression. I like to ask people some regional history questions.